Perfect. So thanks for joining January 15th. So Director's Cut release of data for November 2018. And just quick housekeeping, dates for Director's Cut have been posted online for 2019. So as we start the new year, if there's any changes or updates, I'll send out an advisory as we made an adjustment here to this January 1. So with the session in, we may have to be a little flexible on Director's Cut dates, but we'll post those online under the Information Center, and then just make sure that your cameras and then your audio is on mute. So otherwise, Lynn, go right ahead.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks everyone for joining us for the Director's Cut webinar. We're talking November production, and this is that marginal drop in production that we kind of warned people about with winter coming on and the low oil prices. So we saw just under 17,000 barrels a day decrease in production to 1,375,803, 1.2% drop. A small drop in gas production too. We talked last month that it was really the first month that oil and gas kind of synchronized again. So we saw a 1.5% drop in natural gas production as well. When we look at the 2.5 billion cubic feet a day that was produced versus the theoretical amount that industry could have produced based on plant capacity and flaring regulations, I know that's a long sentence, the data would tell us that industry self-restricted about 99,000 barrels a day, just under 100,000 barrels a day. So when I talk about that, part of that I think was the uncertainty around gas capture. They produced through much of November without knowing what the Industrial Commission was going to do at its November meeting, so they may have over restricted. On top of that, November was our first winter weather month, and so we took a look at that. Now the website where I used to go get the weather information is not there anymore. So I'm searching for a new one, which will give me the details, but I can give you some summary information. We had 14 days of November that it was 15 degrees below normal, and we had precipitation for most of those 14 days, either some rain or some snow. And so we saw winter weather begin to set in mid to late November, and that in conjunction with the uncertainty surrounding gas capture resulted in a significant amount of self-restriction on the part of oil companies. So they could have produced significantly more, but they restricted to try to meet the gas capture requirements, which they did not, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The downturn in drilling permitting, November, December is normal. People all try to have their permits in hand by Thanksgiving so that they can conduct all of their site construction before freeze up. And so it's just normal to see permitting activity drop off in November, December, and January. We'll start seeing it pick back up here in a month or two. The oil prices are much better, and Justin will talk about that. I think the differential, the WTI, largely corrected itself later in the year and continues to do so. So oil prices are improving. The rig count has remained very solid. So industry continues to be cautiously optimistic. They're running 68 rigs today. So they have not backed down on rig count at all. Although with the cold weather, they'll be reducing the frac crew count. And so we'll probably see the non-completed well count begin to grow through the winter. Interesting story about Fort Berthold. It went just the opposite direction. 4 additional rigs. So they went from 12 to 16 rigs on Fort Berthold. Production actually increased 1,500 barrels a day, whereas it decreased statewide. Set a new record for wells. There has never in history been more than 2,000 wells producing on Fort Berthold Reservation. So we have a new, I think, a significant milestone there. And when you look to the future, looking at this being a tier 1 Three Forks area, so fairly significant future well density, we're looking at another 4,500 wells that are going to be drilled on the reservation. before the drilling is completed. We also saw the uncompleted well count drop on the reservation, and approved drilling permits went up. So in every single category that we've been tracking, it went the opposite direction of the rest of the state. And I think a large part of that is operators wanting to get their wells constructed and in the ground and producing before any changes might take place in terms of taking over flaring regulation or changes in the tax agreement with the state. All those things are up for grabs right now. Flaring regulation with the BLM and the tax agreement with the state, because the legislature's in town. So I think operators were anxious to deploy rigs and get wells drilled in advance of that. When we turn to gas capture, pretty much flat in terms of the volume flared. The amount captured down just very slightly. So again, we have 79% capture statewide, 80% of the Basin, 81% on lands outside of Fort Berthold, only 73% on the reservation, and of course the trust lands fell to 68% capture. So again, that's our problem area, that's our struggle, and part of the partial federal government shutdown is no BIA right-of-ways. So since the shutdown began, there have not been any BIA right-of-ways approved, and there won't be until the BIA goes back to work. In conjunction with that, our negotiations on flaring regulation with the BLM and the tribes negotiations came to a halt. The folks who would conduct those negotiations at the BLM are furloughed, and along with that, let me see, I had one other thing noted there on the partial government shutdown. Let me flip a couple pages here, and that would be the Forest Service comments. So the Dakota Prairie Grasslands comment period was extended to tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. There have been requests for an extension of that extension, but there is no one there to accept the requests or to grant them. So we are going to go ahead and file comments on the draft EIS with the, I guess you'd say the caveat that should, or when they go back to work, should they extend that deadline, we're reserving the opportunity to supplement our comments. So I think in light of the fact that there's no one there to receive the comments or to grant an extension, you have to file the comments with a request that if an extension is later granted, that you can supplement your comments. So that's pretty much the rundown for November. Oil production down slightly, gas production down very slightly. The first month of any kind of winter weather, it was pretty cold and wet in November. And along with that, we had the gas capture uncertainty. So the data is telling us that there was a very significant amount of operator self-restriction on oil production. That would indicate to me that we're not likely to be imposing production restrictions from the Industrial Commission, but we're still going to run through all the calculations and see where that lands. Questions?
Can you elaborate on why flaring went up just a little bit if there was so much self-restricting going on?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. The primary reason I think that flaring went up a little bit was the activity on Fort Berthold Reservation. Where we saw flaring increase was in the drop on Fort Berthold. I believe in the prior month, let me just check here. Gas capture on Fort Berthold trust lands was 70%. It fell to 68%. So activity picked up significantly on Fort Berthold, and we lost a lot of ground on gas capture there. So the self-restriction that took place was everywhere else, and and it wasn't enough. So we still lost ground on gas capture. Statewide, only a very small amount, but a significant amount on the trust lands.
A couple questions here related to the BIA right-of-ways. Do we know typically maybe how many are approved each month? And then what does it mean or impact might we see with BIA right-of-ways not being able to be approved right now?
So the average that we heard about in terms of BIA right-of-ways runs around, if I recall correctly, they have typically been approving on average one a day. So we'll be looking at now at this point some 20 right-of-way applications probably, or in that neighborhood that are going to be delayed. The impact of that is likely to be very small unless it goes on for a significant amount of time, because these would be right-of-way applications for pipeline construction that would take place in May or June. So as long as it gets itself resolved and they have the staffing to catch up, there should be very little impact. But if we see it, drag on for 2 or 3 times this long, then there's going to be enough of a backlog that it will impact things in May or June.
Thank you. Any other questions?
The self-restriction estimate that you have, can you talk about how you calculate that? I think that ERC gave a lower number for November and then gas capture for the gas storage study. And I know that it's somewhat based on anecdotal information. How do you come at 99,000?
Yeah, so you're right. I think they estimated somewhere between 50 and 80,000 in that neighborhood, and that number I think probably was based on October production numbers. But the way I estimate it from the data is I take the actual plant capacity, which in the case of November includes partial operation of the Wild Basin plant, but not full operation. I add the 12% additional flaring that's allowed to that, and then I compare that gas production number to the actual gas production number and divide it by the gas oil ratio. And so, yeah, it's a kind of a complicated petroleum engineering calculation, but it gives us a pretty close estimate to what industry could have produced versus what they actually produced. So plant capacity, including the Wild Basin, which was supposed to be fully on in November but didn't make it, would have been 2.4 BCF a day. If you add the 12% flaring allowance, so that would get 2.7 BCF, and industry actually restricted production to only 2.5 BCF. So based on the gas oil ratio, that gives you around 99,000 barrels a day. So they actually shoot for plant capacity plus 12%, and then they try to stay on the conservative side of that, and they undershot by a significant amount here. I think the norm that we've seen on a month-by-month basis over the last year or so has been that 50,000 number, that they try to stay in that range, below, so that they don't get production restrictions from the Industrial Commission. But with the uncertainty surrounding the 80% and 88% or 85 to 88% increase, they over-restricted.
With delayed gas capture talks with the BLM, is February still a time frame that we were looking at, or would possible rules being finalized maybe be delayed as well?
I don't see any way at this point that we could arrive at an approved and signed agreement with the BLM by the 1st of February. So I think we're looking at least a 1-month delay in terms of taking over the gas capture regulation. I mean, we were making a lot of progress, but even when we come to a full agreement with the staff that we were working with, it's going to have to go through the solicitor's office in Washington, D.C. So I just don't see any possible way that could happen by the 1st of February at this point.
Any other questions in the room for Lynn? I might have just a couple more here. Does having an approved drilling permit improve the value of land, even though a well has not been drilled?
I would have to say yes, because it signifies that the company has been recognized as the operator of the spacing unit or the potential wells. And so all of that analysis goes into that, as well as the fact that once you get an approved drilling permit, it demonstrates that the surface location is acceptable. It's outside of the areas of interest, or it's inside the areas of interest but has passed all the tests. It meets all the setback requirements. It's not endangering a shallow aquifer, all of those things. Plus you have a well design and operating rights or a large enough working interest percentage to be recognized as the operator. So yeah, I would think it would certainly bump the value of the leases.
And then one last question just came in too, just in regards to comments being submitted with the grasslands. Is there anything that is worth mentioning just in regards to what those comments might be?
Okay, sure. So our comments from the Industrial Commission are going to touch on 3 areas of concern. The first area being that the newly designated no surface occupancy areas will encapsulate or surround some parcels of private and state lands. So they by nature would limit access to privately owned surface and minerals or state-owned surface and minerals. So we're proposing either some adjustment of the no surface occupancy to allow for access corridors, or some very robust waivers and exemptions that the grasslands manager could grant to allow access, because it's not good government to surround someone's property and limit the access to it. And in working with the Forest Service, they were able to identify for us that there's a lot of, I guess what you'd call tier 1 or minimum maintenance trails and roads out there that could be upgraded to a lease road for access. So that's concern number 1. Concern number 2 is that there's about 21 square miles that requires at least a 2-mile long horizontal or directional well to access the federal minerals under there. And not that technology isn't workable for every oil and gas formation in the state. So again, we're proposing that something be done to reduce that, or waivers and exemptions be provided. And the final concern deals with some very severe timing limitations on hydraulic fracturing within 1/4 of a mile of any of the existing or future campgrounds in the grasslands. And that 1/4 of a mile and those timing limitations are based on a very conservative air quality analysis that was done by some folks, assuming that any oil field equipment working there would burn diesel. And so we're recommending that they provide for waivers and exemptions and modifications if an operator designates that they're going to use natural gas fueled equipment. So yeah, now you know the whole thing. Three concerns, 3 recommendations of how they could modify the draft EIS, make it acceptable for future development on privately owned minerals, state-owned minerals, and also working around the campgrounds.
Thank you. Justin?
Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Justin Krinkstead, Director of the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. We will get started right away. Just a quick update on production around the region. Really no changes. Everything very static between our neighbors to the west and to the south. Continues to be 3 active drilling rigs in eastern Montana currently, and 0 rigs active in South Dakota. Again, Lynn covered the production changes. The last time we had seen that type of reduction in natural gas, you'd have to go back to the month of December of 2016 for that type of loss in natural gas production. If you remember, that time frame was severe winter weather in that month, as opposed to some of the challenges that Lynn outlined that the industry was experiencing in November. When we look at overall transportation of crude oil in the month of November, there were some shifts, a couple % shift onto the rail network when we look at overall transportation of crude oil out of the region. We'll take a look at some of the fundamentals of why those barrels would have shifted towards rail. The first being a continued strong spread between the Brent WTI pricing, and then I'm going to bounce ahead here just slightly. Actually, I'm going to back up. I'll get to that in just a moment. So when we look at, again, the dominant mode of transportation continues to be pipeline out of the region, around 70%. Today, as we sit, no major changes in that Brent WTI spread, so I would suspect that we're going to continue to see rail transportation and pipeline transportation market share stay relatively stable. When we look at the volumes on slide 6 of crude by rail out of the region, still hovering right around that 300,000 barrels of oil per day leaving by rail car. The West Coast continues to be the dominant destination for those barrels out of North Dakota. When we look at pricing on slide 8, again, the PAD 5 area, particularly the Pacific Northwest, is where those Bakken barrels are destined. The strongest pricing in the country when you look at what refineries were paying. Typically, that PAD 1, the East and West Coast, are typically hand in hand for pricing. But this is the first time that it's really stuck out, almost a $2 difference, price advantage on the West Coast as opposed to the East Coast. So if that continues to hold true, I will suspect that we'll continue to see a bulk of North Dakota's crude by rail heading west as opposed to east. Pricing today, as I just alluded to, over $8 spread between WTI. It continues to be large enough that any barrels that have flexibility in their marketing will look at rail transportation again to the east and west coasts. Slide 10, no changes month to month. I've seen some emails coming in already to me wondering why this has not changed. The International Trade Commission, because of the federal government staffing and funding, have not updated this information for November. So once that information comes in, I'll be able to get that updated on my website and then at the next webinar in February. So the other thing that was taking place, so Lynn had outlined in November the weather issues, gas capture, the completions. But another thing that was taking place in November, which was challenging North Dakota's oil and gas industry, was the severe price discounts that were occurring in the month of November. If you look up on the screen or at slide, looking at North America's pipeline infrastructure, again, last month I've been discussing the PAD 2, the Midwest refineries and the Great Lakes and other Midwest states going through a major turnaround period in the months of September, October, and then coming out of it in November. So slide 12 just shows the refinery throughputs at the lowest point, almost 1 million barrels per day taken offline at PAD 2 or Midwest region. So barrels that were typically moving east out of North Dakota into that market, again, experiencing some pretty severe price discounts. In November, Bakken pricing in that Midwest region was anywhere from $20 to $15 below WTI, which was very uncommon since we had Dakota Access going into service not too long ago. So as you can see on the graphic, as the industry moved out of November into December, that started to normalize. It still took a good month or so for the industry to work through a backlog of crude that had been moved into that region, put into storage. By the end of December and early January, Bakken crude oil pricing going into the Midwest to the Great Lakes region was back on par with WTI. And as we sit today, about a $1.80 premium for Bakken crude oil at Clearbrook, Minnesota. So in November, $15 to $20 discounts from WTI as we sit today, almost a $2 premium for Bakken crude in the Midwest. So again, much stronger pricing today than the industry was experiencing in the month of November. Just a quick update on my crude oil production forecast. Again, I just put this in as a reference case. We're still expecting some potential, there's growth potential coming through this winter month. It's going to heavily depend upon what Mother Nature does, how the spring looks with load restrictions and other seasonal issues that the industry has to deal with. But the potential's there with prices where they're at today. The industry could grow, but that growth rate is going to heavily be weighted by Mother Nature and other seasonal factors. Slide 15, just touching on the natural gas capture. Again, as Lynn alluded to, 20% capture. I'm sorry, 20% flaring. We did see the blue piece of this pie chart grow, and so that is the percentage of gas that's being flared from unconnected locations. Typically, that's been in the 2 to 3%. The last couple of months, we've seen that grow in October and now again in November. When we look historically, you'd have to go back several years to get to data where we were at 5% flaring from wells that were unconnected. And so this is something that I'm going to, now that these numbers have been consistent for a couple months, I'm going to dig into this a little bit more and see if there are problematic areas, if it's widespread, or what is really the root behind this. Is it something that we see changing as new gas plants come online? But again, in 2 months now of 20% flaring, and then month-over-month growth and flaring from unconnected wells. So that is something that I will be digging into, and hopefully by next month I can have a little bit more color for everyone on that factor. We look at wells producing and wells selling. Again, no major indicators there as to what's taking place. The number of new wells selling gas and producing gas are still hand in hand. So that doesn't give us any immediate clues unless I dig a little bit deeper here in the next month. When we look at the new plants coming online, again in the short term, as we move into the end of the first quarter and throughout 2019, we're going to continue to see these new gas plants coming online with additional capacity that's going to significantly improve this gas capture situation. So we'll continue to watch this month over month, see how this evolves and shifts, and we'll continue to watch that production trend line so that industry starts to position itself for post-2020 and what type of investments going to be necessary in order to stay ahead of this curve going forward when we look at the long-term future on slide 19. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
With the uptick on rail, what are you hearing on per barrel rates to East and West Coasts?
I've not seen anything official on rates. I'm still assuming somewhere between $6 and $8 per barrel transport costs going west and $7 to $9 going east.
Any other questions for Justin?
Do you expect in December that we'll see improvement on gas capture from the Wild Basin?
So the question was, what do I see taking place in the month of December? The Wild Basin plant, as Lynn alluded to, is online, not at full capacity yet. So it's real difficult to say if that plant was at full capacity and moving. I think I'd have a little bit more confidence that we'll see a significant improvement. I know that the gas gathering industry was having more success in the month of December as opposed to November, but overall, it's going to depend on what production is doing at the same time.
Any other questions for Justin?
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Just a reminder too, before folks dial off the phone, Justin's slides are available on his website. So if you go to the Pipeline Authority's website, there is a link there at the top that says monthly updates. So if you want access to his report and as well as his PowerPoint slides, that's where you can get that information. And then we also post the director's cut, of course, in our information center on the oil and gas website. So otherwise, we'll see you guys next month.
Thank you.